Since honesty is the best policy, I will come out and say that the majority of Seiko watches do not appeal to me. That's not to say that all of them don't. Watches in their tool categories fascinate me for many reasons. They will be thoroughly revised in the future. And Grand Seiko is an entirely different subject that will be discussed in great detail. But today the discussion is centered around the Seiko Prospex line. More specifically, the release of the 2019 Prospex LX, reference SNR029J. A watch that neatly sits in the echelon between entry-level and high-end wristwatches, and a watch that I believe has the Submariner on the ropes for a few reasons. Now, in hindsight, before Rolex devotees get too angry with me, the reason why I'm saying this is purely because the Rolex Submariner line has not changed in nearly a decade. Just looking at the way Rolex has situated themselves, it is a shame that they did not freshen up the sub in 2019 by including their new movements and tapering down the cases. Instead, we received a two-tone 43mm sea dweller, which has to be one of the most divisive additions to the Rolex catalogue in years. Who was asking for this watch in the first place? If they don't do anything about the sub in 2020, we might be seeing riots in the streets. Just looking at one of its competitors, the Seamaster 300 Professional, it has been completely overhauled and is being bought by the truckload by many of those who are tired of waiting for any Rolex sport piece, or more specifically, want an amazing performing watch for good money. Adding a bit of background, most new watch releases don't grab my attention instantly. I prefer to take my time before being won over by watches that are launched. Last year, the Seamaster Professional made me stop and say, now that's cool. And this year, surprise of surprises, the release of the Prospex LX made me stop and say the same thing. So in this discussion, I want to center the Prospex head-to-head with the Submariner. Let's start with some similarities between the two pieces. Interestingly enough, both were inspired by designs of the 60s, so their DNA is well established. Both of these pieces have taken the modern stance, introducing elements like sapphire and ceramic into their builds. Both are oversized and legible at a glance. They both take the concept of the dive watch and make it so. They both are 300 meters water resistant, they both have 120 click bezels, screw down crowns, you know the rest. But in fairness, that is where the similarities end. The first major difference that I want to discuss is not to do with their designs, but their movements that drive them. This is not what I do on this channel. Most of the time I discuss watches by looking at their aesthetics, but I think to make my point clearer, this is going to be something to think about. To do this, I'm going to use a real-world example. The Ferrari 2002, one of the most successful racing car designs in history. It is an absolute beast. There is no other way to put it. Would you look at that? How convenient. One is just about to pass by. Sings like an angel, doesn't it? This car ran a V10 engine. It could push out over 20,000 RPMs and could top out at 320 kilometers an hour, about 200 miles an hour. Fantastic. Arguably the peak of purely mechanical performance, pushing the engine to the absolute limit of what it is capable of. Now we have the Ferrari 2019. Yes, it sounds like it's running on an elastic band. It has a measly V6 turbo and sounds awful in comparison to the 2002. But with 8 gears, more torque and a hybridized engine, this car is capable of boosting its performances dramatically by salvaging energy from its braking and converting it into electricity. The car reaches top speeds exceeding 330 kilometers an hour, accelerates unlike anything in the world and handles like it's on rails. The differences are dramatic. Both cars are great, but the older car, the 2002, loses a lot of its potential when paired up with the more modern 2019 car. And that segues neatly into the purely mechanical movement compared to the spring drive movement. Mechanical movements are great. They have lasted decades. They are renowned for their functionality, but they can be better. The spring drive takes that potential of the mechanical movement but regulates it with the accuracy of quartz. So in the end, instead of your watch running plus or minus 5 seconds a day, which is still phenomenal, the number is reduced down to 1 second a day. Maybe that doesn't mean much to some people, but I think it is an important element that divides these pieces from the get-go. The Seiko is a more accurate watch, with less moving parts, but still is mechanical and as hard as nails, and odds are you'll only have to service the watch in maybe 20 years' time. The name Prospex is an amalgamation of the two words professional specification, and the LX is an abbreviation of lux. In Latin it means light. So professional specification light. That's a pretty cool name, well thought out. And look at the logo. You have to be in the know, or quite eagle-eyed to see a P and an S overlapping each other at a glance. Nice brand identity. What draws me to the watch first is the case and the bracelet. This has always been one of the standout features of these watches. Like most Prospex and Grand Seiko pieces, there is such an attention to detail to the finer finishing of the watch. Both the cutting and the polishing focuses on sharpness as opposed to fluid forms. It has a name to it, Zaratsu, meaning mirror blade, and it is a design language that Seiko has become known for. But the one area that my eyes are always drawn to is the center link. The aggressiveness of the center link and how it ties in with the lugs that stand proud. It truly is exquisite. I don't think anyone can refute that. And that then leads to the bracelet that follows in a similar vein. The watch measures to be 44 millimeters in diameter, and yes, that is considerably larger than the Submariner. But because of the way the case has been finished, and more importantly how the lugs have been designed to form around the wrist with as short a length as possible, this watch would pass to fit and appear more like a 42 millimeter piece. Also, a small detail is that it is made of titanium, so it will be both harder and lighter than steel. I find it interesting that the color of the titanium has been handled so well. The term they use is bright titanium, an alloy that is 1.5 times harder than 316L stainless steel. The surface of the material does not have any proprietary coatings, and its scratch resistance is between 300 and 350 on the Vickers scale, compared to 316L steel at between 180 and 200, and pure titanium at 100. This is a phenomenal material, because it manages to keep the bright luster that we want to see on a steel watch, all the while having a secret up its sleeve. Let's cut to the chase. What really brought this watch to my attention was the dial and the bezel, and the simple way of explaining why it appealed to me so much is that the watch understands space allocation. Space plays such an important role with a dial, and it says a lot about the thought process of a watch. There is a near perfect balance of each element, and that is why the watch visually looks smaller on first impressions, because the indices are large enough to accommodate the space, while the hands, with large counterweights, fill the space no matter where they are set. When your eyes move between the 7 and the 8 o'clock position, you see a small power reserve indicator in the corner. The positioning was a very interesting choice, but what is more interesting is how the hand is arranged. There is a beauty to asymmetry, and this is one such example of how it is done right. The placement is unobtrusive and visually not impactful, filling the dial without cluttering it. I think the decision of having the hand vertically pointing downwards when it is fully wound is also an excellent touch, making it look a lot tidier. Another important element to highlight is the depth of the dial. It has been recessed into the case. Now personally, I think this makes a dive watch all the more visually impressive. Though it doesn't add or serve a purpose really, depth to the dial is a visual foreshadowing. Notice then that another element, the minute track, was added in a form of a ring that allows the dial to step down. And then moving to the usage of the hands, being pencil-shaped, the hour hand being short and fat, and the minute hand being long and thin, easily discernible at a glance. The bezel is clean, with the correct choice in font that is legible and timeless. And when you pan away from the watch and look at the watch entirely, it appears so simple to the eye, but there is complexity to it, far more visual complexity than what a Rolex Submariner offers. Say what you want about the name Seiko and the brand. This is an exquisitely designed watch. And the irony is that Seiko collaborated with an acclaimed industrial designer to make it happen. His name is Ken Okuyama, and he developed the entire line of the LX pieces. I only learnt this after the fact while doing this write-up, so maybe I have an eye for this stuff after all. Now let's talk about the critiques and compare it to the Submariner. There are a few pitfalls with this watch, and some choices make me scratch my head. The most glaring of them comes in the form of the crown. Call it what you like, a horn, a growth, a wart, but its size just isn't necessary in the slightest. The bonus is that it is positioned at the 4 position, meaning that it will never irritate the wearer's hand. Also, it is recessed into the case, something I wish more manufacturers would do, but even still, it's garish. So on the left is the original crown, and on the right is the crown after I reworked it. You can make the call on what you think works better. My guess is that the oversized crown is another visual cue. The size adds emphasis to its intended function, but it's not in the least bit subtle. Next, the watch's clasp. All Seiko pieces are synonymous to have stamped clasps. Love them or hate them, they serve their purpose. They are slim and conform well to the wrist, but from a purely mechanical background, a milled clasp would probably be more reliable in the long run if we're going to talk about durability. Then, looking at the Submariner, what does it have? There is no denying that this is an exquisite piece of engineering. It is simple, understated, functional. It deserves a top spot of being one of the best dive watches on the market. But barring all of that, it is a Rolex. You are buying a Rolex. Over the decades, Seiko has had this stigma surrounding the majority of their pieces, and to many purists, the idea of a Seiko being compared to a Rolex is blasphemy. But the reality is that a piece like this is in direct comparison with its Swiss counterparts, and has the advantage on many levels, but then it also needs to be compared against them. The awkwardness comes down to the price point. Here I have arranged 3 watches in order of price. The Prospex LX sits in between the other 2. Now you are sniffing paint if you think that you can just walk into the authorized dealer and buy a 2019 Submariner. And after a while you will be able to get your hands on the new Seamaster, one watch that I really appreciate. So the question is, would you pay that little bit extra for a titanium watch with a spring drive movement, which I would imagine is on par with Omega's new METAS certified caliber? Just looking at them side by side, there are a few elements that I think Seiko did that trumps the Seamaster, like the font and the layout on the bezel, like the allocation of space given to the counterbalance on the hands and the power reserve indicator. But in saying that, the only watch that is out of date here is the Submariner. We might be seeing a massive overhaul in 2020. This watch raises a lot of interesting points, like, does it pip the Grand Seiko diver? Am I a Philistine for even saying that? And yes, design-wise, I think it has an edge in a few areas. Does it deserve to be treated with respect when placed beside the giants of the Swiss watchmaking industry? Will it ever lose the stigma of just being a Seiko? This piece is the result of many years of development, and I see the DNA of all 3 of the above pieces in this watch. And as a result, the final design is cohesive, simple, and highly functional, far from being generic. One that I believe does have a competitive edge against many of its rivals, both in higher and lower echelons. It is a watch that caters to a different audience, but undoubtedly a highly spec'd watch that both enthusiasts and professionals of the highest calibers could use with confidence.